Yeah, it's a really intense piece of writing.
It really is. And, we want to transition immediately into our first piece of structural feedback, but we do need to acknowledge the piece's strong, defiant tone and its vivid, contrasting imagery, like comparing the nation to a leading lion unfazed by frightened Europeans, before we dive into the constructive analysis.
Right, absolutely. The tone is definitely a powerhouse. But moving to that first critique, the rebuttal to the opposing claim that the death penalty serves as a reward for terror leaves a logical gap that weakens the overall persuasive power of the monologue.
Oh, that's a really interesting point. How so? Well, the weakness is in how the text handles its critics. It mentions critics, specifically citing jurists like Kremnitzer, who argue that the death penalty is an act of bloodthirstiness that actually rewards terror.
Right. The whole idea that executing them gives them the exact martyrdom they want.
Exactly. And the text dismisses this by stating that the October 7th massacres occurred without a death penalty in place.
I mean, that is a historical fact.
It is. But while this proves that terrorists do not, need the death penalty as an excuse to commit atrocities, it fails to actually dismantle the critic's core premise.
Ah, I see where you're going.
Yeah, the critic's premise is that state-sponsored execution might elevate these individuals to martyrdom, thereby giving them the reward they seek. The rebuttal basically just sidesteps the reward argument rather than defeating it.
It's like plugging a leak in a ship. Say your ship is taking on water, right?
Okay, yeah.
And someone suggests drilling a new hole to let the water out. The critics are saying, don't do that. A new hole will sink us faster.
Right.
And the author is responding by saying, well, the ship was already taking on water before we poked another hole. I mean, saying the ship was already leaking doesn't prove the new hole is safe. You have to prove why the new action actually patches the ship.
That is a perfect analogy. Pointing out the pre-existing leak doesn't prove the drill is a good tool. It just proves the ship was already sinking.
Exactly. So what's the fix here? How do we actually patch the hole?
The suggestion here is to directly attack and dismantle the martyrdom as a reward premise, to create a much more robust and legally sound counter-argument.
So hit it head on instead of just relying on the timeline of past violence.
Precisely. For concrete example, instead of solely relying on the fact that violence happened prior to the law, the text could argue that capturing, trying, and executing terrorists systematically strips them of the chaotic battlefield glory they seek.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that completely changes the framing.
Right? You frame the execution as this sterile, highly bureaucratic process. It denies them the dramatic, violent death they idolize. It reduces them from holy warriors to, just inmates being processed by an unfeeling legal system.
It's paperwork in waiting cells, not a battlefield. That takes the glory entirely out of the equation.
Exactly. Or alternatively, reframe the concept of the reward itself. The author could argue that keeping terrorists alive in prison creates a literal reward, the hope of future prisoner exchange.
Oh, I really like that angle.
Yeah, and the death penalty permanently removes this leverage, ensuring they can never be used as living assets.
Right, because a living terrorist in a prison cell is basically political leverage. They become a constant beacon of hope for their organization to kidnap innocent people, to orchestrate a trade.
Exactly. So by defining the real reward as the hope of release and extortion, and showing how the proposed law eliminates it, you force the opposing side to defend keeping living leverage in prisons.
Which is a much harder position for those academics to hold than just warning against the abstract concept of martyrdom.
Definitely. It tightens the logic beautifully.
Building on that idea of the enemy's psychology, if we completely abandon this attempt to convince the terrorists of anything, if we stop worrying about whether they feel rewarded or deterred, we actually solve another major issue in the text.
Oh, what's the second critique?
So the argument simultaneously claims the enemy is driven by a culture that sanctifies death, yet it relies on the conflicting hope of deterring them with the threat of execution.
Yeah. That is a massive thematic clash.
It really is. The weakness here is this significant thematic and logical friction right in the middle of the piece. The author effectively characterizes the enemy as belonging to a culture that sanctifies death, standing in stark contrast to our sanctification of life.
Which is a highly evocative, powerful binary to set up.
It is. It anchors the whole emotional weight of the monologue. However, moments later, the text argues that if there is one terrorist who will think twice before he goes out to slaughter us, it is worth it.
Wait, really? After just saying they worship death?
Yes, if the enemy truly worships and seeks death, the threat of death is fundamentally incapable of serving as a deterrent.
That causes some severe cognitive dissonance for the reader. I mean, deterrence requires a rational actor who values their own life more than committing the crime.
Exactly. This reliance on deterrence completely undermines the earlier, much stronger characterization of the enemy's psychological state. You can't have it both ways.
Right. You can't make the enemy look like an unfathomable monster driven by a dark theology, but also treat them like a rational bank robber weighing a cost-benefit analysis.
It waters down the existential severity of the threat they just spent paragraphs building up.
So, what's the suggestion to fix this contradiction?
Shift the justification for the policy entirely away from the concept of psychological deterrence and lean fully into the themes of absolute incapacitation and societal protection.
Okay, so abandon the hope of changing the enemy's mind entirely.
Precisely. For concrete examples, the most immediate step is to just remove the line about hoping a terrorist thinks twice.
Just cut it completely?
Cut it and replace it with language focusing on absolute prevention. For instance, state that the law is not meant to serve as a warning to future attackers, but as the ultimate, definitive closure that protects the living from ever facing that specific individual again.
Frame the execution strictly as incapacitation.
Yes, guaranteeing the safety of soldiers and citizens by ensuring the threat is permanently erased, rather than hoping to change the minds of those who, frankly, cannot be deterred.
That is so much stronger. It moves from prevention by fear to like prevention by physics. The state acts and the state protects, regardless of what the terrorist thinks or desires.
And it honors that initial setup that the enemy sanctifies death while providing a purely logical, fiercely protective reason for the law.
It really does. It tightens the structural logic and reasserts the sovereignty of the state.
Now, considering this purely protective mechanical logic, I want to pose a question about audience alignment, because this brings us to the final hurdle in the material.
Okay, let's hear it.
If the author is speaking to an audience that already largely agrees this law is historically and morally just, doesn't spending the whole time defending the law's philosophical existence kind of miss the target? Shouldn't the entire focus be on pressuring the leaders to actually use it?
That targets the final structural issue perfect. The practical, opening distinction between passing the law and actually implementing it gets lost in the emotional crescendo of the conclusion.
Yeah, it really drifts away from the initial premise.
It does. The weakness is that the monologue opens with a highly specific, actionable, and urgent concern. The death penalty law has been passed, and now it only remains for it to be implemented.
Which implies the real hurdle is internal bureaucratic or legal hesitation, like the pen is hovering over the order, but no one will sign it.
Exactly. However, the remainder of the piece, including the very powerful closing maxim that mercy to the cruel is cruelty to our lives, defends the philosophical existence of the law against external European pressures and academic critics.
Right. It never circles back to demand the actual signature or execution of the policy.
Leaving the initial premise completely unresolved.
It's a classic trap in persuasive writing. The emotion overtakes the utility.
Yeah, authors get so caught up in the philosophical defense, so swept up in the momentum of dunking on ivory tower academics, that they forget to ask for the sale.
It feels good to win that abstract argument, but it is politically useless if the domestic leaders still won't sign the paper.
Right. Because of this drift, the audience is left energized, but without a clear directive on what to actually do with that energy.
So the suggestion, obviously, is to anchor the final rallying cry back to the immediate practical hurdle of implementation, so the audience is left with a concrete demand, rather than just a philosophical stance.
Exactly. We need to physically tie the end of the piece back to the beginning.
How do we do that concretely?
Well, for a concrete example, immediately following the final phrase about mercy to the cruel, add a direct, unambiguous call to action demanding that the legal system drop its hesitation and sign the execution orders today.
Give them a clear directive.
Yes, and another example is to create a thematic bookend by contrasting the external and internal threats.
Oh, using that imagery from the beginning.
Exact. The author could argue, we have stopped fearing the frightened Europeans. Now we must stop fearing our own power. Implement the law.
Oh, that's brilliant. That ties the vivid imagery from the opening directly to the required action at the end.
It weaponizes that defiance against the internal bureaucratic hesitation. It forces the audience to realize that the delay in implementation is just another form of the weakness they were just rallying against.
It funnels all of that scattered passion into a single, highly specific point of pressure, transforms a philosophical essay into an undeniable political demand.
It's like building an impenetrable wall. Right? You build it high, it looks strong from a distance, but if you walk up close and the mortar hasn't cured, the structure is vulnerable.
The philosophical defense is the wall, but the practical implementation is the mortar. Without demanding implementation, the wall is just for show.
Exact. So let's briefly summarize the 3 main actionable takeaways for the author to seal those gaps. First, attack the martyrdom premise directly to strengthen the counter-argument against legal critics.
Right. Argue that sterile execution strips battlefield glory, or that keeping them alive rewards the terror organization with leverage for prisoner exchanges.
Second, drop the deterrence angle to maintain consistency with the culture of death concept, focusing instead on absolute incapacitation.
Abandon the contradictory hope that an enemy who sanctifies death will think twice, and focus on unyielding societal protection.
And third, tie the powerful closing maxim directly back to the practical demand for immediate implementation.
Create that thematic bookend. We stopped fearing external critics. Now we must stop fearing our own power. Implement the law today.
We invite the listener to revise this material using these structural adjustments and submit it back to the critique for another review.
Keep building, keep reinforcing, and make sure every word serves a definitive purpose. Catch you on the next critique.